Buenas tardes. Vamos a dar comienzo a esta sesión de la tarde del Seminario Internacional 20 años de la Carta de Derechos Fundamentales de la Unión Europea, su aplicación por los tribunales nacionales. En esta ocasión tenemos el placer de contar como moderador con el profesor Francisco Fonseca, que es director de la Representación de la Comisión Europea en España, y, a su vez, con el director de la Agencia Europea de Derechos Fundamentales, el señor Michael O'Flaherty. También participarán en el debate la profesora Serena Forlatti, de la Universitat y Ferrara, y Yolanda Gamarra, de la Universidad de Zaragoza, que lamentablemente no puede acompañarnos online, pero que sí nos ha trasladado una pregunta a realizar al señor O'Flaherty. En consecuencia, sin mayor transición, voy a dar la palabra al profesor Francisco Fonseca. Muchas gracias.
Supongo que se me oye. Buenas tardes. ¿Se me oye? Buenas tardes.
Se oye, se escucha muy bien.
Buenas tardes. Bueno, pues en primer lugar, muchas gracias a la Universidad Pompeu Fabra.
Sí, perdón, no sé si puedes conectar la cámara.
Sí, lo he intentado antes, pero parece que no.
Ahora se ve perfectamente.
Voy a hacerlo otra vez.
Gracias.
Voy a hacerlo otra vez. Share vídeo, no sé si se me ve ahora.
Bueno, no lo hacemos en audio tampoco. Muy bien, perfecto.
¿No se ve?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Bueno, muy bien, pues decía que en primer lugar muchas gracias al profesor Santiago Ripoll y muchas gracias a la Universidad Pompeu Fabra por la organización de este seminario sobre los 20 años de la Carta de Derechos Fundamentales de la Unión Europea. Mi tarea aquí consiste en presentar al keynote speaker, que es mi amigo Michael O'Flaherty. Hello, good afternoon, Michael, how are you? Y muy brevemente explicaros que para mí es un motivo particular de satisfacción estar aquí. No voy a usar más de 3 o 4 minutos, pero en fin, simplemente recordaros que el reglamento que dio lugar a la Agencia de Derechos Fundamentales es un reglamento que efectivamente cumple 20 años, el reglamento 168-2007, del 15 de febrero de 2007, y es un reglamento que tuve el honor de negociar en nombre de la Comisión Europea, en mis responsabilidades en aquellos tiempos, y para mí fue una de las aventuras más fascinantes que he vivido a lo largo de mi historia en la Comisión Europea. Y fascinante tanto por las materias que estábamos tratando, como de las complejidades institucionales que hubo que sobreponerse para llegar a ello. Muy brevemente, la Agencia de Derechos Fundamentales es la consecuencia directa del acuerdo del Consejo Europeo de Niza, en el cual se decide que la Carta de Derechos Fundamentales de la Unión Europea queda proclamada, pero no incorporada a los tratados, y que en cualquier caso esta carta, como pronto dijo el Tribunal de Justicia, debía ser interpretada como principios generales del derecho de la Unión Europea. En ese sentido, tener un organismo independiente que se ocupara de, como dice su propio artículo 3, que se preocupara de hacer la colecta de datos, que se preocupara de hacer los estudios necesarios, que se preocupara de efectuar dictámenes o recomendaciones sobre los temas en torno al ámbito de aplicación material de la Carta y en torno a la actuación en sí mismas de las instituciones europeas, parecía esencial. El reglamento, proponiendo la creación de la Agencia de Derechos Fundamentales, fue un camino muy arduo, en el cual hubo que vencer muchos obstáculos y hubo que sortear auténticamente un mar plagado de tiburones. Para empezar, por la búsqueda de la propia base jurídica que permite crear la agencia. Como todos saben, no descubro nada nuevo, hubo que recurrir al actual artículo 352 del tratado, en el momento 308, en el cual se establece que cuando no hay una competencia atribuida expresamente a la Unión Europea, se puede hacer cuando se desarrolla uno de los objetivos básicos de la misma, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, aquí la exégesis he de reconocer, y algún ilustre jurisconsulto, como el profesor Garzón Clariana, que nos estarán escuchando, también fue testigo de ello, que fue una apuesta arriesgada y que fue una apuesta que planteó muchas dificultades para que fuera asumida por el Consejo. El Consejo solamente aceptó esta base jurídica si limitábamos el campo de aplicación, el ámbito de aplicación de la Carta, a lo que en aquel momento, tal vez un poco ingenuo, se pensaba que eran materias del primer pilar. Lo cual, efectivamente, no era algo que agradara extremadamente al Parlamento Europeo, pero, en fin, yo creo que uno de los secretos escondidos de la Carta es que cuando empezamos a negociar el reglamento, el entonces responsable, el vicepresidente de la Comisión, Franco Frattini, nos dio una instrucción a los negociadores. Tenemos que trabajar como si estuviéramos en codecisión, por lo tanto, la Comisión tiene que trabajar estrechamente y dar seguimiento a las enmiendas que vengan del Parlamento Europeo. Y eso creó un ámbito de confianza institucional que permitió llegar a un resultado satisfactorio. Por eso quería señalar este aspecto de la aventura que me parece fundamental. El segundo ámbito que quería, sobre la originalidad de las agencias fundamentales, que quería plasmar aquí, es la necesidad de encontrar un modus vivendi entre esta agencia y el Consejo Europa, porque decir con toda sinceridad que el Consejo Europa tampoco veía al principio con muy buenos ojos esta agencia, por lo que pensaban podía ser una invasión de sus competencias. Y de ahí esta estructura en la cual el Consejo Europa participa en el Consejo de Administración de la agencia y al tiempo hubo que negociar un acuerdo internacional entre la Unión Europea y el Consejo Europa para establecer, uno, la capacidad del Consejo Europa de participar en la agencia y dos, cuál era la limitación de competencias de cada uno. Como diría nuestro amigo Michael, all in all, yo creo que el resultado fue aceptable. Yo creo que hoy está muy claro, sin ningún problema o fricción particular, la división de trabajo entre el Consejo Europa y la Agencia de Derechos Fundamentales. Hoy, la Agencia de Derechos Fundamentales es un organismo central en la Unión Europea. Hoy, la Agencia de Derechos Fundamentales es básica para que realmente la Unión Europea tenga una opinión imparcial e incluso, si me permiten la expresión futbolística, el riesgo de una tarjeta amarilla cuando se desborda en actuaciones, por ejemplo, en política exterior y ciudad común, se desbordan actuaciones que no podrían considerarse estrictamente como nuestras actuaciones de derechos fundamentales en interno, y aquí hemos conseguido que la agencia, en mi opinión, pero Michael hará después, consiga disciplinar todas estas tensiones. Acabo aquí, es a lo mejor la historia de un abuelo ya, de un abuelo de prehistórico de la agencia, pero me parecía importante dejar aquí todos estos elementos y sin más, Michael, it's a real pleasure to introduce you. You know that Michael Flackert is the director of the Fundamental Rights Agency. Michael Flackert is the fundamental rights man in Ireland and in Europe in general. In his impressive curriculum vitae, Michael Flackert has been a key element in the United Nations system. Michael had a real adventure in the former Yugoslavia countries working in terms of fundamental rights. Michael is a full professor at the University in Ireland, and without no doubt, Michael is for all of us a reference in the field of fundamental rights in the European Union. Thank you, Michael. The floor is yours.
Paco, thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be with all of the colleagues on this important occasion. I apologize for imposing English on you. That's my weakness, but I'm very glad to be with you. And I'm conscious in the presence of Paco Fonseca that I'm in the presence of one of the architects of the modern fundamental rights system of the EU. And this should be acknowledged and duly respected. But dear friends, look at how we're meeting. Our chair is wearing his mask as he must. We're all virtually distanced. We live in very strange times. They're also very strange times for fundamental and human rights. The COVID has rapidly increased the fundamental rights challenges for not only all of us, but for those who are most vulnerable on the edges of our societies. And I say this right at the beginning, because if we talk about an instrument, a charter of fundamental rights, we're talking about it in terms of its impact for social change. And the challenge today is so enormous to seek to achieve that in the context of the pandemic. Now, the instrument itself, the charter, was set up with very great ambitions to tackle the great issues of the moment. Let me quote to you from the President of the European Court of Justice just last year, Koen Leenaerts. He said, "The entry into force of the Charter as a source of primary union law is one of the most important achievements in the history of European integration. It shows that the European integration project is more than an internal market. The EU is, first and foremost, a union of democracies, a union of justice, a union of rights and values, which draws on the constitutional traditions common to the member states." But I could also paraphrase Article 1 of the Charter, which says that it puts the defense of human dignity at the heart of the Union. So these are lofty claims for this legal instrument, and today provides me with an opportunity for a stock taking. I would like to look at different aspects of the Charter to see to what extent they bring that value added that we so desperately need at the present time. The first element of my stock taking has to do with the acquis of rights. To what extent does the Charter add to the existing acquis of human and fundamental rights? Well, of course, I'm not going to go through the Charter now, but just to briefly recall first, there are 50 articles dealing with issues of substance, and the clusters in which they are grouped really tell us a lot about the subject matters they engage. Dignity, freedoms, equality, solidarity, citizens' rights, and justice. And what do they look like, these 50 provisions? They're a mix of the familiar and the novel. The familiar is the classic corpus of rights that you would expect to see in a human rights instrument. But, and this is the first unique feature of the Charter that I would mention, it unites the two great categories of rights, civil and political, economic, social and cultural, in a way that was never achieved, for instance, in the United Nations treaties. What's more, there are novel rights in the Charter, which you will not find anywhere else. Very importantly for today's Europe, there's an explicit asylum right. There's the right to found a business, which is a wonderful conversation opener with people in the business world who don't really get the point of fundamental rights for their work. There are strong, explicit environmental protections. There is a right of good administration. As well as these novel rights, there are expanded rights, rights that are much more strongly expressed than in, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights. To take three examples, the right to an effective remedy and the related rights to fair trial, much more broadly stated in the Charter. The ne bis in idem rule, the guarantees of freedom of assembly and association, a lot stronger than in the Strasbourg instrument. So one can conclude then on the first element of stock taking, the body of rights, that the Charter does indeed add to that body to a notable extent. And it does so in a way that takes account of the realities of contemporary life. If we use the language of human rights for a moment, it updates human rights law to deal with contemporary realities within the scope of application, obviously, of the Charter. Let's go then to the second issue of the legal status. To what extent does that bring value to us? Because, of course, we have to acknowledge at the outset that it's not a treaty. This instrument doesn't have the same status as the European Convention and the other instruments. But that is not a constraint. To the contrary, it's a positive, because the Charter has a status of primary EU law. This means, unlike so many of the treaty-based instruments, it has a binding character, including for the member states. And this is particularly interesting when we assess the material scope of the Charter as compared to national constitutions. Last year, the Fundamental Rights Agency did a study comparing the Charter with national constitutions. We looked at 27 constitutional texts. We found some very interesting things. We found that 22 of the 50 rights in the Charter are missing in the majority of national level constitutions. And in fact, 9 of the 50 are missing in more than 20 of the EU constitutions. Rights like the right to good administration, rights of the elderly. You do not find them at the national level, so having them with direct effect in the Charter is of notable significance. But now let me turn to my stock taking to aspects that could be seen to curtail the influence of the Charter. The first of these concerned the scope of application specifically as concerns member states. Because Article 51 of the Charter famously provides that the provisions apply to the member states only when they are implementing union law. Now, when do they implement union law? There are two main situations. The first is where the member state is required to fulfill specific obligations under primary or secondary EU law. And the second is where member states seek to limit a fundamental right under the treaties. So here we have undoubted limitations on the application of the Charter that have to be taken account of today when we consider its impact. This brings me then to an aspect of the treaty that can also notably affect the scope of its application. This is the troubled issue of the distinction in the Charter, it's not a treaty, of the instrument, the distinction in the instrument between rights and principles. The Charter recognizes both categories, but fails to say which elements of its contents are one or the other. This matters, since principles can only be invoked before a court if implemented by legislative or executive acts. The distinction and the lack of clarity is an undoubted cause of confusion, and it's problematic. But it's important today, as we do a stock taking, while acknowledging the issue, not to overstate it. Firstly, this distinction of rights and principles is not about status. They have the same quality. And secondly, very importantly, to dispel a myth that's very common out there, it is not to say that all the elements in the solidarity section of the Charter, the socioeconomic side of the Charter, are somehow just principles. It is not correct to say that everything in the Solidarity Charter is at the level of principle. There's a quality of right in there to be elaborated through the practice of the European Court of Justice. And one last notable issue of scope of application that actually expands the force of the Charter and is unique to it, not to be found in the human rights treaties, and that is its horizontal effect. By horizontal effect, of course, I'm referring to its direct application between private parties. Now, this right or this application is not explicit in the Charter, but it has been recognized by the European Court of Justice since 2014. And the court is, over time, developing criteria as to when this principle of direct effect comes to apply. And so far, 3 rights have been identified: the right to non-discrimination, the right to paid annual leave, the right to effective judicial protection. Now let me turn finally, in terms of my stock taking, most importantly, to the issue of impact. Does the Charter make a difference for human lives. Now, the ultimate test of that, echoing what I said about COVID at the beginning, would be exactly that, a measurement in society of how the application of the Charter makes a difference. But that's beyond my scope today. Instead, what I would put before you is an assessment which is repeatedly done by the Fundamental Rights Agency of how the Charter is put to use by key stakeholders. And it's on that that we must limit, for the moment, our assessment of impact. We are continuously evaluating this at the Fundamental Rights Agency and publishing the results on an annual basis in our annual Fundamental Rights Report. Let me briefly talk about the EU and quickly get to member states. First, the EU institutions. There's a growing use, particularly in the Commission, an impressive growing use and prominence of the Charter that I think, while can always go further and can always do better, nevertheless needs to be commended. Turning then to the European Court of Justice, here too we see impressive developments. I quoted Koen Leenaerts earlier, a champion of the Charter. But let's look at the hard figures. In 2013, the European Court of Justice, in its judgments, included 100 Charter references. Not bad, you might say. But in 2018, the figure was 350. That's a remarkable escalation in just a 5-year period. One caveat, though, to this use of the Charter in the European Court of Justice is, harking back to my earlier remark, that just 10% of the references relate to socioeconomic rights, the Solidarity chapter. But let me now move to the level of most interest for us today, member states. It's a very mixed picture. First, governments. We don't find much explicit reference to the Charter in the work of governments. We don't find action plans, unfortunately, for the promotion of awareness and use of the Charter. And it's unfortunate because under Article 51 of the Charter, states are under a duty to promote it. Turning to parliaments, broadly speaking, across the EU, the situation is not much better. We see very little evidence of the Charter explicitly being invoked for the scrutiny of legislation or for the operation of parliamentary committees. One interesting counterexample to that is that of Finland, where there's a formal requirement for all draft legislation to be certified as Charter compliant. Turning then to the other national stakeholders, given the nature of today's gathering and the limited time available, I would focus exclusively on the legal profession and on the courts. Let me take first the judiciary. Again, this is something we are watching on an annual basis. It's difficult to assess across the EU member states, but we do discern a modest and a growing invocation of the Charter within our courtrooms. This is evidenced, for instance, in the references to the Charter in requests that are made by national courts for preliminary rulings of the European Court of Justice. Today, some 11% make reference to the Charter. We also see reference to the Charter in judgments, and it's growing, and we're mapping it in a tool of ours called the Charterpedia, which captures, and I'd invite you to use Charterpedia, which captures significant relevant national jurisprudence. And interestingly, we also see the Charter being increasingly used in courts where it was never intended to be used, as an interpretive tool outside areas of EU competence. Moving then to the legal profession more widely, just a few months ago, the Fundamental Rights Agency did an analysis of questionnaires submitted to the European Commission by 700 legal professionals across the EU. We identified that of the 700 respondents, 30% said that they used the Charter in their work. However, more than half of the respondents said that they did not have enough knowledge of the Charter to fully use it to the extent that they would like. That then brings me to an important issue of training. And staying with the same questionnaire, less than 30% of the respondents had ever had any Charter training. And 80% of them said they would wish to have more. So I'll pause my stock taking at that point and see if I can draw any brief conclusions. I would, even based on my short words this afternoon, that we can conclude that we do have a powerful instrument, certainly with its formal and legal limits, but nevertheless held back not so much by its terms and its provisions and its application, but rather in the levels of its use or its underuse, above all else, at the national level. A primary impediment is an unwillingness to invoke the Charter, and this is in part a function of low levels of awareness and knowledge. And it is, of course, ultimately for that reason that I so applaud you for convening this conference. But let me say here on this point that while I present to you a low level of knowledge and awareness, I'm not unduly concerned. The Charter is only 10 years in force. Human rights instruments take a long time to bed down. Just think about it. The European Convention on Human Rights, when it was 10, it was 1964. How many people do we think knew about the European Convention, were using the European Convention in 1964? So if we put ourselves in a similar situation for the Charter, I think we can be rather reassured that things are not as bad as we might conclude. And so then, to wrap up my comments to you this afternoon, what would be, to my mind, the headline issues that require attention? The first one, obviously, is training. The European Commission is investing heavily in supporting training on the Charter. I applaud that. I applaud the many civil society initiatives in partnership with the Commission. We at the Fundamental Rights Agency play our part. But we must all, including at national levels, we must invest and reinvest in building up awareness and training. Secondly, technical tools. It's not always easy to apply the Charter. The issue of the rights and principles, the issue of the scope of application. And so we need ever more hands-on, manual, practical tools for practitioners to see how the different elements are applied in different settings. And I'm very pleased that the Fundamental Rights Agency is also performing its part in this regard. We published a very practical hands-on manual last year on exactly this issue, and we will continue to roll out tools as we see that we can fill a gap. And third, of course, we need our member states, governments, to take more of a leadership role in championing the Charter across their work. They need to drill it into policy making. They need to support its presence in human rights plans of action. They need to support its bedding down within parliaments, so that, for example, we could have Finland-like compliance checks of draft legislation. And let me reassure all of you as I wrap up, through the ways I've already mentioned, but through ever more development of tools and resources and partnerships for training, you can count on the Fundamental Rights Agency to accompany you and lawyers across the EU as we face the future. Now, I began my words today talking about COVID. I would like to end by talking about COVID. No law is going to deal with the pandemic. No law alone is going to protect our rights, stand up for us under great pressure. But all the efforts in the world, if they're not bedded in law, will lead nowhere. And within the toolbox, the European Union toolbox of law, at its very heart, its star, is the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And so I would invite all of us together to journey into the future, bringing that star in the toolbox to life, making it, as a matter of fact, the Magna Carta of European fundamental rights that it was intended to be. I thank you for your attention, and again, I do apologize that I've had to speak to you entirely in English. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Flackert, for your presentation. We know you need to leave at 5 p.m. more or less. However, Serena Forlatti from the Università di Ferrara would like to pose one question to the director. Serena, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for inviting me to this very interesting conference. I would like to, there are many things in your presentation, Professor Flackert, that were very, rose questions and many things I would like to discuss, but I will just focus on one aspect that you mentioned somehow in passing. You mentioned the importance of checking the impact of the Charter, and I wonder whether you could tell us more about its impact in another area where it doesn't necessarily have to, or it's not necessarily supposed to have an impact, but maybe it does have an impact. I'm thinking of the relationship between the Charter and the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Social Charter, that is other fundamental rights charters applicable to the European sphere, although of course to a number of states which are many more than the ones for whom the Charter is in force. Professor Fonseca at the outset, before you spoke, mentioned this difficult start with the Council of Europe. I would greatly appreciate your own perspective after 10 years of actual implementation of the Charter as a legal tool as such on this relationship. Is it a strained relationship? Is it a mutually fruitful relationship? How do you see things? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that interesting question. I think the relationship is really very strong across multiple sectors. I was in Strasbourg virtually a few hours ago for a meeting of the ECRI, the European Commission on Racial Intolerance, one of the strong bodies of the Council of Europe. And I saw nothing but a really strong complementarity and a sense that Europe needs both of us. And for the 27 EU member states, it's the work of both that will trigger those big social changes that we're all striving for. The examples given this morning, actually by a Council of Europe spokesperson, were that the Council of Europe has its very strong monitoring bodies, but the European Union, including through the work of the Fundamental Rights Agency, has the data. And it's the combination of the evidence base that we're producing and the monitoring that they're doing that is bringing an effect. And that's just an example from this morning. But the bodies of law are highly complementary. They have different scopes of application. They have different legal status. They're not competing. At no point is a lawyer ever expected to choose, to dispense with one, but rather to interplay them to bring the best effect within the given configuration of a judicial system. Keep in mind also the modernity of the Charter. In its scope of application, it covers ground that isn't covered in, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights. You have the joined up nature of the great families of rights in the Charter and so forth. And all of this then is echoed. Because I'm afraid my Spanish is, I couldn't even say it's rusty. It's so weak. So I didn't have the possibility to listen to Paco as he spoke, or to understand rather. But if he was referring to the maybe shaky basis for the establishment of the Fundamental Rights Agency, indeed it was a controversial issue back 11, 12 years ago, that the EU was moving into territory that was perceived to be the business of the Council of Europe. That's ancient history now. We couldn't work more closely, and it's indeed, back to the point I made at the beginning, it's about going together, stronger together than weaker if we weren't all in place. I think I'll leave it there. I'm rambling a little bit, but yes, maybe last point, there is of course the issue of the EU becoming a party to the European Convention on Human Rights. It's a tricky business. I'm impressed by the renewed commitment by this new European Commission to achieve it. You know, they could have left it behind as a legacy of the old Commission. They haven't. They've picked it up as a priority issue. I'm optimistic. I think it'll be achieved. I think it'll be achieved in our lifetimes, and I think it will send a very, very powerful signal of our EU being that Europe of values that I quoted us as being from that speech of Koen Leenaerts earlier. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Flackert. Now, I want to excuse Yolanda Gamarra. She has not been able to participate in this conference due to a health problem, and she apologized for her inattendance. As you know, Yolanda Gamarra is member of the Council of Administration of the European Agency. She has been recently nominated to the management board, I think. And well, at this point, I think I only want to thank once again the director for his time and his nice presentation that has reaffirmed us in the idea that the European Union is absolutely compromised with the protection of fundamental rights. And well, it has been a honor for us, and I give the floor, the word to Mr. Fonseca. Okay, thank you, Director.
Do you hear me? Hello?
Sí.
Hello? Excuse me, Santiago, I have a problem with the connection.
Que puedes poner punto final a la sesión.
Ah, okay, sorry, because I was thinking in the question of Michael Flackert, but at this moment you were my micro was off. No, okay. In any case, thank you very much. I fully convinced Michael that will join the European Convention of Human Rights sooner than later. But of course, in my humble opinion, the enemy is maybe into our camp, and not only in the Council of Europe, but to my knowledge, but you know better than me, Michael, the comments of the Court of Justice in its opinion 2013, I believe that we have overcome this question in the current draft mandate of negotiations. But of course, we have a small political problem to be overcome with our own member states. But I am still optimistic on that. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Michael especially for having accepted that. Thank you to the university and to Serena and Yolanda. Yolanda, take care of your health. It was a real pleasure to follow this section. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. We are going to end this session at this point. I want to thank once again the director of the agency for his time, and also Paco Fonseca and Serena Forlatti for her interesting question. Thank you, all of you, for your participation. We'll come back at 6 p.m., 6 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Sí, buenas tardes. Vamos a, como se ha podido apreciar, el director de la agencia tenía que abandonar la sesión a las 5 de la tarde. Queremos agradecerle, bueno, pues el esfuerzo que ha hecho de estar con nosotros, de atender las preguntas, y les emplazo a volver a conectarse a las 6 de la tarde, cuando ya analizaremos la siguiente cuestión, la aplicación de la Carta de Derechos Fundamentales por los tribunales españoles. Muchas gracias.